Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's live webcast, Understanding the Current FCPA Enforcement Landscape. Today's webcast is the first of two in our FCPA Summer School series. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, August 25th, entitled FCPA Third-Party Compliance Best Practices, and registration will be open soon, so please watch your email or check our website at www.hiperos.com for more information. So before we dive into today's topic, I just want to thank everyone who's dialed in and joined us. Hiperos is pleased and honored to sponsor today's event. And for those of you who are new to us, I just want to quickly introduce who Hiperos is. We are a software as a service company that is the market leader in third-party management. And as you can see by the logos on your screen, our technology is being used by some of the largest companies and brands in the world. And you'll notice that these logos cross multiple industries. The importance of managing third parties isn't contained to just one industry. It's a challenge for every company across the board. There are complexities of doing business with tens, or in some cases, hundreds of thousands of third parties. And to define what we mean by when we say third parties comprise everything from vendors to suppliers to contractors to manufacturers on the cost side of the balance sheet, through brokers and distributors and sales agents and channel partners on the revenue side. So all of the third parties that make up your extended enterprise. Every third party relationship has some risk associated with it, risk that can affect regulatory adherence, revenue, and reputation. Our customers rely on us to help them assess these risks and to manage third-party risk across the entire organization. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Mike Kaler. Mike is a leading expert in the FCPA. He's testified before Congress regarding FCPA and is a frequent speaker before business and academic audiences. He is also the founder of the website FCPA Professor, which has been described as the most authoritative source for seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. Mike, welcome, and I'd like to turn things right over to you.
Thank you, Sharon, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Hiperos for hosting this event. And last but certainly not least, thank you to the participants for joining this webinar, and I hope you're able to join us for the second installment of this summer school series in August. In terms of the learning objectives for today's webinar, I would like to focus on three topics. And again, this is all under the general heading of understanding the current FCPA enforcement landscape. The first learning objective I would like to talk about is understanding the root causes of FCPA scrutiny. From there, we'll take a look at some current FCPA enforcement theories. And last but not least, we'll talk about how the FCPA is enforced, not only substantively, but what that may mean for companies that are under FCPA scrutiny and or resolving FCPA enforcement actions. In terms of the first learning objective, I think it's very important to understand why FCPA scrutiny happens in the first place. A lot of times the statement is made that good companies don't bribe, period. And the notion is that FCPA scrutiny and enforcement only happens to bad companies. I would like to dispel that notion rather quickly. While it is true that, yes, some companies under FCPA scrutiny are quote-unquote bad and unethical companies where the conduct at issue may have been conceived of and carried out in the corporate boardroom, the vast majority of FCPA enforcement actions involve otherwise ethically sound and good corporate citizens. So the question is thus posed, well, how is it that good, otherwise ethical companies can be the subject of FCPA scrutiny and enforcement? And I like to focus on two root causes. One is sort of a legal concept I'll have us explain in layman terms. And the second is just understanding, no doubt as you all do already, some of the realities of doing business in the global marketplace. So starting with the first concept, and that is respondent superior. It's a general legal concept, and basically under respondent superior, a company can face legal liability. And here we're talking about both civil liability and criminal liability for the conduct of employees and agents to the extent those two elements are met. This is a general legal principle, and is the reason why companies often face contract liability, the reason why companies often face tort liability, and yes, the reason why companies often face FCPA liability as well. What makes this general legal principle, and this is sort of unique to the United States because many peer countries do not have as flexible a concept as we do under U.S. law. What makes this controversial is a company can face this legal liability even if the employee or agent that is acting contrary to the organization's pre-existing compliance policies and procedures. That does not matter as a matter of law under U.S. law. This is what makes FCPA enforcement fundamentally different, for instance, in the UK Bribery Act and the FCPA-like laws of many peer countries. So it's very important for an initial starting point to understand how it is in many cases a company can do this general legal principle. Second, a typical company, if you will, and let's just say that this typical company has 10,000 employees worldwide or 1,000 third parties worldwide. This may be an understatement or an overstatement given your particular company, but let's just say that this represents a typical company. In most areas of life or other endeavors, we would consider 99% success to be phenomenal, right? But just, pause for a second and consider what 99% success means in terms of a typical company. Even if 99% of your employees or agents, using those figures we just looked at, are compliant on a daily basis, that still means that, running the numbers, you're having a lot of legal risk areas and indeed some potential violations that are occurring on a daily basis. So respondent superior is one of the reasons why many companies doing business all over the world through thousands, if not tens of thousands of employees and agents are often the subject of FCPA scrutiny. Another significant reason that's key to understanding this current enforcement climate is some of the realities of doing business in foreign markets. I don't have to tell many of you that you already understand that doing business in some foreign markets is sort of like navigating a maze. And for U.S. companies and other companies subject to the FCPA, there's going to be many what I'll call foreign barriers, distortions, and other conditions of doing business in foreign countries that your company is going to encounter. And this slide contains several bullet points, by no means exhaustive, but typical barriers and distortions that a U.S. company or other companies subject to the FCPA will encounter when doing business. And although it's not the topic today, in terms of conducting an FCPA risk assessment, which is a fundamental element of having FCPA compliance policies and procedures, you need to understand your regulatory points of contact and where your company is interacting with alleged foreign officials. So think of it in terms of a narrative, right? Barriers and distortions create bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracy creates points of contact with foreign officials. The FCPA is all about interactions with foreign officials. So these points of contact with foreign officials create just, and discretion, of course, creates the opportunity for a foreign official to misuse their position by making bribe demands. I'm not at all suggesting that all FCPA enforcement actions are the result of these foreign business realities, But if you dig into the details of most FCPA enforcement actions, you'll see that these are really some of the root causes of why the company got in trouble in the first place, which again, from a risk assessment standpoint, makes it very important for companies to take a step back, to look at their business, to look at their business relationships and ask, where are the points of contact in our company with foreign officials? Those may be different depending upon the country at issue. Those may be different depending upon the division or subsidiary we're talking about, but it's a very important fundamental concept from a compliance standpoint. Another reality of doing business in many foreign markets is what I'll call forced business relationships. In many countries, a U.S. company cannot do business directly with a foreign customer. Pursuant to local laws in many jurisdictions, China is a notable example, some Middle Eastern countries are notable examples, you need to engage a third party, whether we call that third party a local sponsor or an agent or a joint venture partner. The fundamental concept is that in many foreign countries, one of the conditions of doing business is sort of a forced business relationship. And given the FCPA's third-party payment provisions, something we'll talk about in a few minutes, those relationships can often expose a company to FCPA liability. Even if a forced business relationship is not a requirement, as a practical matter, having a foreign agent or a foreign distributor is often a legitimate, value-added way that many companies do business in overseas markets. So when you combine concepts like respondent superior, when you combine that with some of the foreign business realities, and when you combine that with foreign business relationships, one of the starting points I'd like for you all to have is to recognize the fallacy, right, of good companies don't, period. The fact of the matter is, FCPA scrutiny can occur in large and small companies alike, can occur in public and private companies alike, and can occur in companies in various industry sectors. The takeaway point is if you are doing business in foreign markets, you are going to have, at some level, FCPA risk that needs to be properly managed and dealt with. So I'd like to move on next to the second learning objective for this webinar, and that's to understand the current enforcement theories that exist. Now, again, these are enforcement theories of the Department of Justice and the SEC, not necessarily enforcement theories that have been blessed by courts, although in some instances they have. As many of you know, this is an area of law that is often not subject to much judicial scrutiny because of how the FCPA is enforced through non-prosecution and deferred prosecution agreements. But be that as it may, an FCPA anti-bribery violation, the fundamental elements of that are anything of value that goes to a foreign official to influence that foreign official's discretion in obtaining or retaining business for the company. Coupled with that, we'll also talk about the third-party payment provisions because the vast majority of FCPA enforcement actions do result from the conduct of various third parties that are engaged by a company. Now, in terms of analyzing these elements, I'd like to start by saying what is not the takeaway point. And what is not the takeaway point is the following slide. I'm having trouble advancing the slides here, Sharon, if you want to perhaps advance the next slide. In terms of understanding enforcement theories, the takeaway point is not that this is an area that involves suitcases full of cash to traditional government officials to get government contracts. No doubt all of you before attending this webinar knew that there was some law, whether it was the FCPA or whatever, that prohibited providing suitcases full of cash to presidents or prime ministers to get foreign government contracts. While it is true the FCPA's anti-bribery provisions capture this type of conduct, that's not exactly why this is such a big risk area for companies. Rather, what I want to get us thinking about is the takeaway point of sort of this visual learning device, and that is many FCPA enforcement actions are so far removed from that suitcase full of cash to that foreign official to get a government contract type of scenario, but involve conduct sort of along the periphery that the DOJ and the SEC are nevertheless asserting violates the FCPA. So for our fundamental elements, again, anything of value, foreign official, obtain or retain business, I just want to go through some of the broadness of these elements and discuss some of the current enforcement theories. To state the obvious, we all in our daily lives, and not mention foreign officials, can be influenced in many different ways besides cash payments. And the three examples depicted on this slide, golf outings, Disney World trips, and fancy beverages and fancy dinners, are not merely hypotheticals, but have been allegations that have been included in several recent FCPA enforcement actions. So the first takeaway point, of course, is to recognize that anything of value includes more than just cash payments. And why this is a risk area for companies is if you do these sort of things with some customers, we'd probably be apt to call that effective sales and marketing and maintaining goodwill with customers. But lo and behold, if you do the exact same thing with a certain category of customer or potential customer, that being an entity or a government agency that is involving foreign officials, the U.S. government may indeed label that as bribery. Another important concept to keep in mind when it comes to the anything of value element is the notion that there is no de minimis value associated with something of value. For instance, in a recent FCPA enforcement action, the enforcement agencies made the following allegation. There were a series of small payments to foreign officials, and these payments range from $4 to $1,700. Now, to my knowledge, $4 is the lowest thing of value that I've ever seen alleged in an FCPA enforcement action. And to be sure, if it was merely a $4 payment, there probably would not have been an enforcement action based simply upon that payment. However, I take the position that when the DOJ or the SEC include allegations in an enforcement action, they're doing so not just to practice their typing skills, but to send a message to the corporate community that they should have even small payments on their radar screen. And I think that message was sent in that recent enforcement action that involved payments that were very, very small. Another recent enforcement action you'll see involves some gifts, and again, the point is that there's no de minimis value associated with this first element. It often seems that what the enforcement agencies are doing are really putting themselves in the shoes of the alleged foreign official, right, and asking, how is this recipient perceiving the thing of value? And whether the recipient of the thing of value is subjectively, valuing it. You can imagine in many countries where public servants are paid a very low salary, that $100 payments could have a very meaningful impact on altering the discretion of a foreign official who may be issuing a certificate or a license or something of that sort. So again, the first fundamental element of the FCPA's anti-bribery provisions is anything of value.
Mike, can I interrupt you for a second with a question? Are there any emerging enforcement theories that you think will become prominent in the near future?
Well, one industry that has been under FCPA scrutiny for the last few years, and it sort of goes to this anything of value concept, is the financial services industry, on the theory that some of their hiring practices in China and some other Asian countries were problematic because internships or even full-time jobs were given to sons or daughters or relatives of foreign officials. So what makes this interesting is, one, there has not yet been an enforcement action on this, but based upon public reporting, there's probably a half a dozen, if not more, financial services companies under scrutiny on this issue, and there appears to be some settlement talks. I think this really stretches anything of value, rather extensively, and goes to the response of, even if that thing of value is not going to the foreign official, is the foreign official nevertheless viewing that internship or that job for a son or daughter or relative as something that they value? So it's going to be interesting to see how and if these enforcement actions play out, and if they do, I think there'll be a lot of discussion about them, because it is, an aggressive enforcement theory, to say the least. Turning next to the foreign official element, which again is another key element of the FCPA's anti-bribery provisions, there are some aspects of the foreign official element that are really not controversial, and that is traditional government officials like presidents and prime ministers and heads of state are foreign officials. Not many companies are dealing with presidents or prime ministers or heads of state, but most all all companies doing business in foreign jurisdictions are obviously dealing with, bureaucrats, employees of government departments or agencies that are assessing taxes or customs or duties. The favorite example I like to give on this is there was a U.S. company that simply wanted to open a manufacturing facility in Russia, right? Not doing necessarily any business with the Russian government, but in order to open up that manufacturing facility in Russia, the company needed 244 separate licenses and permits and certifications from various government agencies. And if you think about it, going back to the root causes, that's 244 contact foreign officials that one company had just to open up a manufacturing facility in one country. So employees of government departments or agencies are foreign officials, and again, really nothing controversial about that. The understanding the foreign official element really requires understanding not necessarily a new enforcement theory, because it's been very prominent the last 5 to 7 years, and that is the enforcement theory that employees of alleged state-owned or state-controlled enterprises are foreign officials under the FCPA and thus occupy a status, similar to the president or prime minister. For those of you who aren't familiar with the concept state-owned or state-controlled enterprise, often abbreviated SOEs, these are often profit-seeking enterprises that really have many attributes of private business. In many cases, SOEs have publicly traded stock or other investors. In many cases, SOEs do business outside of their home jurisdiction. For instance, many Chinese oil and gas companies are doing business in the United States, are doing business in Canada, are doing business all over the world. Many SOEs employ not only their own nationals, but non-nationals alike. And SOEs include some of the world's largest companies. But lo and behold, if you dig into the ownership details of some of these companies, they may be owned or controlled, even if not 100%, some threshold of their stock or some threshold of their ownership and control is by a foreign government. And the enforcement theory is that these employees, regardless of their rank, title, or position, are foreign officials. And there is one judicial decision from 2014 concerning this enforcement theory. This is U.S. v. Esquinanza. It was a case out of the 11th Circuit where the defendants allegedly were making bribe payments to a telecommunications company in Haiti. And the 11th Circuit did bless this enforcement theory and stated that an instrumentality, which is part of the definition of foreign official, is an entity that's controlled by the government of a foreign country that performs a function the controlling government treats as its own. So it's essentially a control and function test. It's a fact-based test, and if any of you are interested in reading further about this in terms of the specific factors the 11th Circuit articulated for control and function, again, that decision is U.S. v. Esquinanza. It's not a decision that really has any bright line rule, but is more of a factor-based test. And what's interesting is many people view the foreign official issue as an issue that companies don't need to worry about. Again, this goes back to the, well, gee, you just don't bribe, period. You don't bribe foreign officials, and you don't bribe people that are not foreign officials. But I think this is a rather unsophisticated, if you will, way of viewing foreign official for the following reason. And this slide, I guess, is not the most visually appealing, but I hope demonstrates this concept. Because whether someone is labeled to be a foreign official or not, as a practical matter, determines whether a criminal law applies to the interaction with that person. And because anything of value can include things like gifts, because anything of value can include things like fancy dinners, because anything of value can include things like tickets to sporting events, if that person's a foreign official, that interaction now is subject to a criminal law. Whereas if that person's not a foreign official, and let's face it, most corporate interactions are with people that are not foreign officials, that interaction is not necessarily going to be governed by criminal law. So I think the meaning of foreign official matters for good and ethical companies, because a lot of things of value are things that companies just do ordinarily in the normal course of business, and there's absolutely positively nothing wrong with some of that travel and entertainment and gift giving, so on and so forth. The final element in terms of covering sort of the basic elements of the anti-bribery provisions are the obtain or retain business element. And here it's important to understand the enforcement theory that we're not just talking about things of value to foreign officials to get foreign government contracts, right? So we're not just talking about foreign government procurement. We're talking about things of value to foreign officials that allows the company to get an improper advantage that helps the company do business in a foreign country. And the reason the sort of the red tape figure there and a figure of a port is there is that the vast majority of FCPA enforcement actions in recent years really have nothing to do with foreign government procurement, but rather companies allegedly making payments, again, often through third parties, something we'll get to next, concerning bureaucracy, concerning licenses, concerning certifications, concerning immigration issues, concerning tax issues, right? The very boring, mundane aspects of doing business in a foreign country. So for some of the compliance professionals on the phone, if you're getting pushback, from your business leaders, well, gee, we don't do any business with foreign governments, right? Why do we need to worry about the FCPA? Well, you need to worry about the FCPA because, again, this element has been interpreted broadly to basically cover really most all aspects of a company doing business in a foreign country, whether that's building a manufacturing facility, whether that's paying taxes, whether that's dealing with other regulations or laws. There are a lot of points of contact with foreign officials, and consistent with this theory, that's where we see a lot of the enforcement activity. in terms of third parties,
Mike, I'm sorry, can I interrupt? Can I interrupt for a second? Have any of these enforcement theories been subjected to judicial scrutiny?
Well, I mentioned the U.S. v. Esquinanza decision, the 11th Circuit decision on foreign official. That is one of appellate court decision. But the vast majority of FCPA enforcement actions in this new era are resolved via deferred prosecution agreements, non-prosecution agreements, or administrative actions by the SEC, in which there's, not 1 ounce of meaningful judicial scrutiny. For instance, a couple of hours ago, there was an SEC FCPA enforcement action announced against Meade Johnson for allegedly giving things of value to Chinese physicians. That action was settled via an administrative cease and desist order by the SEC. That order is never going to see the inside of a courtroom, and there will be no judicial scrutiny of that theory. And that's an interesting one, too, because this speaks to the broadness of foreign official, particularly for those of you in the pharmaceutical or medical device or healthcare arenas. This is, by my count, I think now the 16th enforcement action based upon the theory that physicians, lab personnel, and there's even been an enforcement action where the allegations included a midwife, are foreign officials under the FCPA because they are employed by a healthcare system that may be owned or controlled by a foreign government. So, in short, there's very little judicial scrutiny concerning many of these enforcement theories. Now, to understand the anti-bribery provisions, and this is really in terms of compliance an important point as well, because so many of these enforcement actions are based upon the conduct of third parties. And as Sharon mentioned in the introductory portion of the webinar, third parties are a shorthand way of describing many different relationships that companies have, whether it's agents or distributors or joint venture partners. And when you really think about it, the quantity of third parties that many U.S. companies have is pretty amazing. Right? Here's some recent survey data that show the range of third parties. A lot of that, whether it's 100 to 100,000, is often dependent upon the industry, the products. Some industries, technology comes to mind, relies heavily on third parties, whereas some others may not. Now, third parties, of course, are great, right? Because they know how to get things done in a foreign jurisdiction. Well, that also makes third parties risky as well, because local parties often know how to get things done, and sometimes getting things done may be acting consistent with the local business culture, and that local business culture may condone or not necessarily prosecute improper payments or incentivizing payments or greasing the wheels or things like that. And when you look at the enforcement activity, the substantial majority of FCPA enforcement actions, it's probably 85–90% or so, involve one way or the other, whether in whole or in part, the conduct of third parties. So because of this, it's a big risk area, obviously, for companies. And our second webinar in August is going to be drilling down in greater detail best practices concerning third-party relationships. But for present purposes, it's important to understand that a substantial majority of FCPA enforcement actions involve third-party conduct. Now, what the law actually says is that, sorry, I bumped forward a slide too much, is that a company has to have knowledge, right, that a third party is doing something on its behalf to secure or to obtain a business from a foreign official. So there is a knowledge component to the third-party payment provision. But as we'll see in a second, that knowledge element, both in terms of how it's defined in the statute, and certainly how it's being enforced is very broad and very flexible. And you'll see in the next slide some representative examples of recent enforcement activity as to how some third parties, whether distributors or subcontractors or commission payments to third parties, were used to facilitate the payment of bribes or things of value to foreign officials. So the takeaway point from the third-party payment provisions, and again, we'll be talking in the August webinar specifically about compliance policies and procedures, is sort of the following. While the third-party payment provisions, because they do contain that knowledge element, are not exactly strict liability, that knowledge standard has been interpreted so broadly to include concepts such as willful blindness, conscious disregard, so on and so forth. The visual learning device there is you cannot close your eyes or plug your ears or not ask a pointed question because you're afraid to get a bad answer when it comes to the conduct of your third parties. If you're nervous about the ethics or the integrity or even the success of your third parties in some markets, that in and of itself should cause you to engage in due diligence and monitoring and supervision of the third parties. Again, topics we'll talk about in much greater detail in August.
Mike,
One
can
final.
I ask you another question?
Yes.
Sorry. If third parties are so risky, should companies then avoid using third parties altogether?
Well, it depends whether you want to grow market share and be successful and keep your investors happy. No, I don't think third parties should be avoided. Again, as previously indicated, in some countries you don't have a choice. You have to engage a local agent or a local sponsor. So if you want to avoid using third parties in certain countries, you're simply not going to be doing business in those countries. You know, even if it's not required, there's absolutely nothing wrong with third-party relationships. I think sometimes the DOJ and the SEC view third parties as a red flag in and of themselves, which I think is just further to the concept that many enforcement attorneys have very little actual practical business experience, but that's another issue. No, I don't think the answer is excessive risk aversion by eliminating third-party usage, but rather having the risk areas and the third-party payment provisions on your radar screen and be able to recognize some red flags that we'll talk about in greater detail in August, and doing your best to manage and minimize that risk. One final point I'd like to talk about when it comes to sort of the anti-bribery provisions is the following point. It's kind of a minor point, but a very important point that it needs to make it into your training slides and your training policies and procedures. And that is, as to U.S. actors, the FCPA has extraterritorial jurisdiction. What that means is when your business folks and your sales personnel are hopping on that plane for that business meeting in Shanghai or that business meeting in Moscow or that business meeting, you name the location, the FCPA is going to follow them, right? For U.S. actors, there is no way to avoid application of the anti-bribery provision. Not all laws have extraterritorial effect. Not all laws follow U.S. citizens and U.S. companies all over the world, but the FCPA is clearly one of those that, at least as to U.S. actors, has extraterritorial jurisdiction. I next want to talk briefly about the books and records and internal control provisions, because no discussion of current enforcement theories could be complete without talking about these very, let's face it, bland but yet potent provisions because of how they're being enforced. The FCPA was always intended to be a law much broader than its name suggests. We think of the FCPA, of course, as having anti-bribery provisions, something we talked in great detail about over the last few minutes. But it's also important to recognize books, records, and internal control provisions, because these are completely independent of the anti-bribery provision. In other words, even if all the elements of the anti-bribery provisions are not met, let's say, for instance, we have a situation where there's an improper payment scheme that may not necessarily involve a foreign official. Well, if we're outside the context of the anti-bribery provisions, well, we're still very much in the territory of books and records and internal control provisions because they operate independently. So what do these provisions say? Basically, the books and records provisions say that issuers, and here I'm talking about publicly traded companies, must keep, sort of paraphrasing here, but accurate books and records that accurately reflect the distribution and the payments of corporate assets. And in nearly every instance where there's an anti-bribery violation, the alleged improper payments are going to be misreported somewhere on the company's books and records, right? The lavish dinner will be recorded as entertainment expenses. That's true, but the SEC will take the position, well, it was misrecorded because you didn't say it was entertainment of a foreign official to obtain or retain business. The commission payments or the incentivizing payments may be inaccurately recorded on the company's books and records, even if in a foreign division or a foreign subsidiary. And the next slide is straight from the DOJ SEC issued guidance from 2012, where the guidance set forth various examples of how improper payments were mischaracterized on the company's books and records. And by no means is this an exhaustive list, but you can see some of the common ways in which improper payments have been misrecorded on a company's books and records. And what makes this particularly problematic in terms of a risk area for multinational companies is the enforcement agencies take the position that if a subsidiary or affiliates' books and records are consolidated with the issuers for purposes of financial reporting, as they all are, well, a misreporting anywhere in the corporate hierarchy can constitute an issuer, violation. So again, when you read the books and records provisions, they're very bland. There's nothing sexy about them, but they're very potent in how they can be enforced. And the same holds true for the internal control provisions. The internal control provisions, again, paraphrasing here, basically say that issuers must have effective internal controls in place to make sure corporate money is properly spent, to make sure that there's an adequate and reasonable system of checks and balances in place before a company spends money. Again, bland, broad, but very potent, because again, the enforcement agencies seemingly take the position that, oh, because that improper payment was made, therefore the issuer did not have effective internal controls. Because if the issuer did have effective internal payments per year, or excuse me, per month, I think that's a bit of an outlandish enforcement theory, but it's an enforcement theory that the SEC in particular has used to extract corporate settlements, sometimes for immaterial payments. So it's again something that needs to be on the radar screen of all companies. And here I want to stress the point that technically, as a matter of law, the internal control provisions only apply to issuers, again, publicly traded companies, but it's a very good practice for all companies, private companies, all forms of business organization, to pretend, to act as if the internal controls and books and records provisions apply to them for any number of reasons, right? Not the least of which is effective internal controls can help prevent anti-bribery violations, which of course apply to public and private companies alike. So the takeaway point when it comes to the books and records and internal control provisions are really, given the enforcement theories, these provisions are practically boundless. And again, one could sit here the rest of the afternoon and debate as to whether that is what the law says and whether that is what Congress intended these provisions to mean. But this portion of the webinar is about enforcement theories. And in the minds of many, the enforcement theories on the books and records and internal control provisions have become practically boundless. The final learning objective.
I know we're running out of time, but I just had a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Do these provisions apply to all companies?
Well, as I just mentioned, technically as a matter of law, the books and records and internal control provisions only apply to issuers, again, publicly traded companies, but it's a very good practice, risk management practice, for even privately held companies to act as if the books and records and internal control provisions apply to them, because they can help minimize anti-bribery violations, not to mention other, legal violations, something as simple as, embezzlement or other sort of, financial misconduct. The final learning objective for today's webinar is to understand a little bit about FCPA enforcement, and I'm going to start with a few slides on just some nuts and bolts concepts, and then move into what I call the three buckets of FCPA financial exposure. Courts have held that the FCPA does not contain a private right of action. So what that means is only the DOJ or the SEC can bring FCPA enforcement actions. And in terms of, generically describing the responsibilities of the DOJ and the SEC, generally speaking, the DOJ is the one that's going to criminally enforce both the anti-bribery and books and records and internal control provisions, whereas the SEC is, one, only a civil law enforcement agency and only has jurisdiction over so-called issuers. So if you think of this sort of graphically, there's three different types of companies that can be subject to the FCPA's anti-bribery provisions. Those are so-called issuers, again, publicly traded companies. When it comes to issuers, there's actually a dual enforcement regime where the DOJ and SEC can bring enforcement actions against issuers. And a lot, not all, but a lot of FCPA enforcement actions against issuers actually contain a DOJ component and an SEC component. The DOJ only has jurisdiction over what the statute defines as domestic concerns. Basically, these are U.S. companies and U.S. citizens that are not public. And then in 1998, the FCPA was amended to include a third prong, inartfully I think, called other than issuers or domestic concerns. And that's where foreign companies and foreign nationals can often be subject to the FCPA. So the reason I mention this is one, there's oftentimes a lot of comparing and contrasting between DOJ enforcement of the FCPA and SEC enforcement of the FCPA, but that's kind of an apples to oranges comparison because the jurisdiction of these respective agencies is really materially different. To state the obvious, before the DOJ or the SEC can enforce the FCPA, they first need to learn about conduct that could potentially give rise to an FCPA violation. So I want to just mention some of the common origins of FCPA scrutiny. By far, the most frequent origin of FCPA enforcement actions is corporate voluntary disclosures. And indeed, we could have an entire webinar based upon corporate voluntary disclosures and the pros and cons of why companies would voluntarily disclose FCPA violations to the DOJ and the SEC. But the fact of the matter is, if you run the numbers in any given year, approximately 50% of FCPA enforcement actions are based upon voluntary disclosures. Another large source of FCPA enforcement actions, external law enforcement investigations. where the improper conduct is initially investigated by the German or the French. And then they share that information with U.S. law enforcement agencies. And the DOJ and the SEC have been very vocal in recent years of saying how their cooperation with foreign law enforcement agencies is increasing year in and year out. Another big source of FCPA enforcement actions are so-called industry sweeps, the notion that if one company is under FCPA scrutiny, the SEC in particular will send information requests to other companies in that same industry on the theory that if company A was engaged in that business practice, companies B, C, D, E, and F, so on and so forth, may be engaged in that practice as well. Industries that have recently been swept are the oil and gas industry, the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, I already mentioned earlier in the webinar, financial services industry. And in terms of other origins, you name it. There have been undercover investigations. There's been FCPA enforcement actions that have resulted in terms of the origins, it can be numerous. In my estimation, the following slide is perhaps the most important slide in terms of understanding the current enforcement environment, and that's the financial consequences that happen to a company under FCPA scrutiny. And the reason why I think this is so important is bucket number 2 is what we'll call enforcement action day, and bucket number 3 is what we'll call post-enforcement action professional fees and expenses. The vast majority of press coverage and the vast majority of attention is obviously focused on what happens on enforcement action day, the settlement amount. But it is clear that that is not the largest financial consequence for a company undergoing FCPA scrutiny. And it's important to understand this from a compliance standpoint as well, because if you are fighting for compliance dollars within your organization, you want to let your board and your audit committee know that, hey, if we get in trouble here, it's not just the settlement amount. Indeed, that's a very relatively minor component. So in terms of pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses, what often happens in this area is that there's always going to be a point of entry, right? So let's say a company's initial FCPA scrutiny is in country X, let's say China. Well, what's going to happen is before the DOJ and the SEC will agree to resolve that case, they're basically going to ask the where else question. If you were doing this in country X, how do we know you were also not doing this in country Y, Z, etc.? So a lot of times when a company is under FCPA scrutiny, they engage in a worldwide review of their business operations, at least some of the high-risk jurisdictions. What this means in terms of the overall financial consequences is that pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses are generally the largest financial hits to a company under FCPA scrutiny. And when you run the numbers based upon corporate disclosures, you'll see that in many cases, this pre-enforcement action bucket is 3, 5, 10, or sometimes even higher than the settlement amount. So this is often the biggest financial hit to a company under FCPA scrutiny. Bucket number 2, of course, is enforcement action day, the settlement amount. Now, yes, every area of law has a top 10 list, and here is the current top 10 list in terms of overall FCPA settlements. But the point I want to make is, not everything is a top 10 settlement. Now, $14 million is still real money, but a lot of times when you're reading about the FCPA, those that are marketing their compliance services, et cetera, tend to use the most egregious examples as if that's the reality, while every area of law, again, has a top 10 list. In the remaining time, I just want to talk about some of the, and again, these slides will be posted on the Hiperos website, but I want to talk about some of the other negative business consequences, and then obviously leave room for some questions that companies face because of FCPA scrutiny. A lot of times when companies disclose FCPA investigations, there's a hit to the company's market capitalization. The stock price, takes a dive. Even if that dive is only temporary, it can often be 3%, 5%, 10% of a company's market cap. And for business leaders, market cap is very much an important metric. A lot of times, companies under FCPA scrutiny will have their bonds downgraded, which makes the cost of capital much less. A lot of times, companies under FCPA scrutiny will have trouble engaging in M&A activity because an acquiring company can inherit the target company's FCPA liability. And then, as a practical matter, when a company is under FCPA scrutiny, they get very risk averse. And excessive risk aversion results a lot of times in lost or delayed business opportunities. So the takeaway point when it comes to financial consequences, and then of course you always have the plaintiff's lawyers, and anytime a company is under FCPA scrutiny, there's often a feeding frenzy, and plaintiff's lawyers representing investors will bring derivative actions and securities fraud actions against the company. The visual takeaway point is sort of the following slide when it comes to the financial consequences. While settlement amounts get the most press coverage and thus get most people's attention, sophisticated observers and understanders of FCPA enforcement realize that the settlement amount is really just the tip of the iceberg. And most of the money a company spends because of FCPA scrutiny is in the pre-enforcement action phase and indeed in the post-enforcement action phase because of corporate monitors sometimes that are imposed.
Mike, we are at the top of the hour, so I really appreciate you taking the time today to speak on this topic. Obviously, we could be on your FCPA Institute. If you wouldn't mind giving the audience just a quick overview of what that is and how they can participate.
Yeah, if you're interested in elevating your FCPA knowledge and practical experience even further, for the last year and a half, I've been offering in-person 2-day FCPA Institute. These have been previously attended by lawyers from leading law firms and in-house and compliance counsel from leading companies really across the world. And my next FCPA Institute is taking place in Washington, D.C. on August 13th to 14th. CLE credit is available. I know that prior participants have successfully applied for continuing education units from the Society of Compliance and Corporate Ethics for attending this. And space is limited. It's I cap it at 30 participants so we can maintain sort of a classroom-like active learning environment, but there's a few slots left for this August event.
That's great. Thank you so much. So again, thank you, Mike, for joining us today. And thank you. This concludes our webinar for today. Please look for our second installment of this summer school series, FCPA Third-Party Compliance Best Practices. Screen. And you can always log into www.hiperos.com and send questions through the Contact Us form on the website. The slides and the recorded webcast will be uploaded onto our website at the beginning of next week and available for replay. We appreciate your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event on August 25th. Thank you, and have a great day.